In 1885, a penniless farmer named Christopher Crawley watched his fortunes shift on a barren Australian hillside, transforming from subsistence in a rough hut to the construction of Monte Cristo, a mansion soon scarred by whispers of cruelty and unexplained tragedy. The official histories celebrate Crawley's rise, but they rarely speak of the violent deaths inside those thick brick walls, or of how a railway windfall sowed seeds for nightmares that would define Australia's most demonic address. Before the ghosts arrived, something much darker took root, and the true horror begins long before the hauntings ever started. Christopher William Crawley entered the world in 1841, born to working-class parents in Sydney. He grew up with little expectation of inheritance or comfort, his early years shaped by the limits of colonial life. In 1860, at the age of 19, he married Elizabeth Carr. The union joined two young people with little more than hope to their names. Elizabeth's own background, spoken of in whispers but never confirmed in written records, would become a quiet shadow over the family's story. The newlyweds left the city behind and journeyed inland, settling on the edge of the Riverina district. Christopher acquired 2 parcels of land in the hills above Junee, a settlement that at the time was little more than a scattering of slab huts and red dirt tracks. The land itself was unremarkable, rocky, wind-scoured, and far from the established centers of trade, yet Christopher saw something in its contours that others missed. He was not a man of means, but he was patient, and he understood the value of location in a colony racing toward progress. The couple's first years in Junee were marked by hardship. They built a rough slab hut with their own hands and survived on what they could coax from the soil. Christopher worked the land by day, returning each night to a home that offered little protection from the elements. Elizabeth managed the household, her days filled with the unending labor of rural life. As the seasons turned, their family grew. Children arrived one after another, each born into the same hard circumstances that had shaped their parents. Christopher watched the world change around him. News of the Great Southern Railway planned route reached Junee in the 1870s, and he began to purchase land with a gambler's intuition. He made no public boasts and kept his ambitions quiet, but every pound he could spare went into acquiring property on both sides of the proposed railway line. It was a risk for a man with so little to lose, but the gamble would shape the fate of his family and the land at sea for generations to come. By the end of the decade, Christopher's foresight had placed him in a position few could have imagined. The fortunes of the Crawley family would soon change forever, but the years of struggle and deprivation left their mark. The land, the hut, and the relentless labor forged a hunger for security that would haunt every decision to follow. The Crawley family's first home in Junee was nothing more than a slab hut, hammered together from rough timber and patched with whatever could be found. For nearly 20 years, this hut stood against the wind and the dust, its walls thin enough for the cold to slip through at night and the heat to press in by sea. Each morning began before dawn, with Christopher striding out to coax what little he could from the stubborn earth. Wheat, potatoes, a few sheep, enough to keep hunger at bay, but never enough to lift the family from the edge of want. Elizabeth's hands bore the marks of endless labor. She cooked over an open hearth, scrubbed clothes in a tin tub, and patched the children's clothes again and again. Water came from a well, carried in buckets, and every meal depended on what could be grown or traded with neighbors miles away. Year after year, the family grew. Helen arrived first, followed by Anne, then Lydia. Each birth brought hope, but also another mouth to feed, another body to shelter through the winter. Mervyn was the first son, then Marmaduke Aubrey, then Florence Agnes, and finally Angela Christina. 7 children in all, each one born into the same hard world as their parents. The girls learned early to help with the chores, hauling water, tending the vegetable patch, minding younger siblings. The boys followed Christopher into the fields, learning to watch the sky for signs of rain or drought. There were no luxuries. Blankets were patched and repatched, boots handed down until the soles wore through. On Sundays, Elizabeth gathered her children and read from a battered Bible, her voice steady even when her hands trembled from the cold. The nearest town was a day's journey by cart, and news from the outside world came only with the passing of a rare traveler or a letter months delayed. The hut creaked in the wind and leaked in the rain. When sickness struck, there was no doctor to call, only home remedies and hope. Yet the family endured, bound together by necessity and the quiet resolve that comes from having nowhere else to go. Christopher watched the railway surveyors mark their lines across the hills and waited, never speaking of his plans. Every penny he saved went back into the land, and every hardship was carried in silence. For nearly 20 years, the Crawleys lived on the edge of survival, their fortunes tied to the soil and the hope that one day something would change. On July 6, 1878, the silence of the Junay Hills broke with the whistle of the first train. The Great Southern Railway had arrived, and with it came a flood of travelers, tradesmen, and fortune seekers. Christopher Crawley had been waiting for this moment, his land holdings straddling both sides of the new line. He moved quickly, scraping together every pound he could muster to secure a license for the railway hotel. Construction began at a fevered pace, and when the doors opened, the hotel stood directly opposite the new station, its windows facing the iron tracks that had once seemed so distant. The gamble paid off almost overnight. Junay transformed from a scattering of huts into a bustling hub, its streets filled with the noise of commerce and the promise of opportunity. The railway hotel became the heart of the town, drawing in travelers who needed a bed, a meal, or a place to conduct business. Agricultural traders and railwaymen filled the bar, their money flowing into Christopher's hands. As the weeks turned to months, prosperity followed. The hotel's profits soared, and Christopher's reputation shifted from that of a struggling farmer to a man whose judgment could not be questioned. He expanded his holdings, investing in more land, livestock, and local enterprises. By his early 40s, he had retired from the daily toil that had once defined his life. The slab hut, patched and battered, was left behind as the family moved into a modest brick cottage, a temporary stop on the way to something grander. The transformation of Junay mirrored the transformation of the Crawleys. Where there had been hardship, there was now stability. Where there had been hunger, there was now abundance. Christopher's quiet patience had delivered what years of labor could not, a fortune built on the certainty of steel rails and the steady flow of guests through his hotel's doors. Yet the hunger that had carried him through 2 decades of poverty did not fade. The profits from the railway hotel were not spent on idle pleasures. Instead, Christopher began to plan for a house that would stand as a monument to his improbable rise, a house that would overlook the town he had helped shape, built from the same red earth that had once threatened to swallow him whole. The future of the Crawley family would be written in brick and stone, funded by the railway's windfall, and raised high above the dust and hardship of their past. Sandstock bricks, fired in kilns built on the property itself, formed the bones of Monte Cristo. Each brick carried the color and memory of the red Junay earth, shaped and stacked by men whose names were never recorded. The ground floor walls reached 18 inches thick, a fortress against the summer heat and the winter frost. Upstairs, the walls measured 9 inches, still solid and unyielding, but light enough to allow for tall windows and the sweep of afternoon sun across the floors. 12-foot ceilings soared above every room, supported by cypress pine beams on the upper level and lath and plaster below. The foundation, laid without mortar in the old dry stone tradition, settled into the hillside with a weight that time could not budge. No detail was left to chance. The cast iron lattice, ordered from catalogs in Sydney, arrived by train and was set along the verandas, catching the light and shadow in intricate patterns. Ornate plasterwork crowned the walls inside, a silent testament to the craftspeople who shaped it by hand. The original slab hut, once a shelter against poverty, was stripped and rebuilt as stables. The brick cottage became the servants' quarters, its walls now a quiet backdrop to the daily rhythms of the estate. Over the years, visitors and residents alike would marvel that not a single crack had appeared in the brickwork, not even as decades passed and the house stood through drought, flood, and neglect. The mansion's endurance was no accident. Every decision, wall thickness, ceiling height, the placement of windows, was made to ensure that Monte Cristo would outlast its builders. The house was meant to be more than a home. It was a statement, a monument to survival and ambition, built to watch over the town for generations. Behind the grandeur, the laborers moved in silence, laying brick upon brick as the walls rose higher. Their work remains, invisible yet unyielding, holding together a structure that would witness both celebration and sorrow. When the Crawley family finally crossed its threshold in 1885, they entered not just a mansion, but a fortress of memory, one whose strength would hold fast even as the lives inside began to unravel. The arrival of the Crawleys at Monte Cristo in 1885 did more than lift a family out of poverty. It announced their place atop the social order of Junee and the surrounding district. The mansion's wide verandas and manicured lawns became the backdrop for a new kind of life, one defined by leisure, display, and ritual. Invitations to Monte Cristo were coveted among the local gentry. On summer evenings, carriages lined the drive as guests in formal dress ascended the stone steps, greeted by the glow of gaslight and the distant sound of laughter from the ballroom. Dinners stretched late into the night, punctuated by music and the clinking of crystal glasses. The estate's grounds offered diversions that few in the region could match. Christopher Crawley commissioned the first golf course in the district, a novelty that drew visitors from as far as Wagga Wagga. Tennis courts were laid out on the southern lawn, their white lines bright against the clipped grass. Children and adults alike competed in matches, their voices carrying across the fields. These were not the amusements of a struggling farm family, but the entertainments of people who had arrived. Elizabeth Crawley presided over these gatherings with a presence that left an impression on everyone who attended. Always dressed in black lace, she moved through the house with a regal bearing, her posture unyielding and her gaze steady. Local newspapers and guests alike compared her to Queen Victoria, a woman who ruled her domain with dignity and command. Under her direction, every detail of the household was managed with precision. Silver was polished to a mirror shine, linens pressed crisp, and floral arrangements placed just so in the entrance hall. The effect was a world apart from the battered slab hut that had once been their only shelter. Yet beneath the surface of these grand occasions, a subtle tension threaded through the halls. The servants moved quietly, their faces careful, their voices hushed when guests approached. The Crawleys' public image was one of refinement and generosity, but the boundaries between master and staff remained sharply drawn. The family's rise had been steep, and the rituals of status served as both celebration and armor against the memory of hardship. As dusk settled over the hills and the last guests departed, the echoes of laughter faded into silence. The house stood alone once again, its windows reflecting the lamplight, its secrets locked behind heavy doors. For the Crawleys, Monte Cristo was more than a home. It was a stage, one where every gesture, every gathering was performed for a watching world, and where the cost of belonging was measured in both splendor and silence. Servants at Monte Cristo moved with a caution that spoke louder than words. Behind the polished silver and pressed linens, the household ran on strict discipline. Elizabeth Crawley's expectations left little room for error, every task performed to her exacting standards, every misstep met with swift correction. The staff learned to anticipate her moods by the sound of her footsteps on the upper floor, the sharp way she called for a tray, and the silence that followed a poorly arranged table. Dismissals came without warning, and those who remained understood that loyalty meant obedience, not trust. Whispers traveled through the servants' quarters, carried on the breath of those too careful to speak openly. Stories of punishments for lateness, of meals withheld, of a look that could freeze a room. The boundaries between family and staff were drawn as clearly as the lines between the mansion's marble floors and the brick of the outbuildings. Evenings in the kitchen were filled with nervous glances, as if the walls themselves might listen and report back to the mistress upstairs. Some stories stretched further, hinting at secrets that could not be spoken aloud. It was said that Christopher's attention sometimes lingered too long on the younger maids. The line between master and servant blurred behind closed doors, and rumors grew in the shadows, rumors of impropriety, of favors granted and taken away. No one dared confront the Crawleys directly. The cost of speaking out was too high, and the world outside the mansion offered little mercy to those cast out from its protection. For the staff, fear became routine. Each day began with the hope of avoiding notice, of blending into the background of the household's routines. The grandeur of Monte Cristo was built on invisible labor, on hands that scrubbed and polished and carried burdens in silence. The servants were witnesses to both the splendor and the rot at the heart of the Crawley fortune. In the hush of the servants' hall, suspicion grew, fed by the knowledge that in this house, accidents were rarely questioned, and suffering could be hidden behind a locked door. A young maid worked quietly in the shadowed halls of Monte Cristo, her name lost to time, but her story carved into the memory of the house itself. She was said to be carrying a child, and local whispers named Christopher Crawley as the father. What happened next has never been settled. Some say despair drove her to climb the iron-laced balcony and throw herself onto the stone steps below, ending her life in a single, shattering instant. Others believe she was pushed, her death a brutal solution to a scandal that could never be spoken aloud. There are no records, no inquest, no name etched in the parish register, only the silence that followed and the stain that would not wash away. On the steps beneath the upper veranda, a mark remains. Servants tried to scrub it clean, using bleach and lye, their hands raw from the effort. Yet the pale shadow persisted, refusing to yield to water or time. Visitors point to it even now, a faint outline against the stone, and wonder if it is the last trace of a life ended too soon. The story passed from mouth to mouth, growing sharper with each telling. Some remembered the sound of a body striking stone. Others spoke of hurried footsteps, a bloodied apron, the hush that settled over the house for days. As the years slipped by, the details blurred, but the sense of wrongness clung to the veranda. Staff avoided the spot after dark. Children dared each other to stand on the mark, claiming the air turned cold and heavy. Guests spoke of seeing a pale figure pacing the balcony at night, her face hidden by tangled hair, her steps tracing the same path over and over. Whether the tragedy was a desperate act or a crime concealed by silence, it left a wound that never fully healed. In Monte Cristo, cruelty did not vanish with the morning. It lingered in the mortar, in the hush of the hallway, and in the stain that no amount of scrubbing could erase. The first death was not the last. The house had begun to collect its debts. The coach house at Monte Cristo stood apart from the main residence, its brick walls sheltering the horses, carriages, and the staff who cared for them. Among them was a boy named Morris, barely more than a child, whose job was to sleep on a straw mattress in the shadow of the stalls. For servants like Morris, illness was a risk not just to health, but to employment. One morning, when his body failed him, Morris stayed in bed, too weak to rise for his duties. In the world of Monte Cristo, there was no patience for weakness. The master, convinced the boy was malingering, decided to teach him a lesson that would not be forgotten. A match struck in the gloom. Flames caught quickly on the dry straw. The master expected Morris to leap up in terror and run for the door, chastened and ready to work. But Morris did not move. Fever had left him unable to save himself. The fire spread, feeding on the mattress, the blankets and the hay scattered on the floor. By the time anyone realized the boy's cries were not those of protest, but of agony, it was too late. The coach house filled with the smell of burning hair and flesh. Morris's screams echoed through the yard, then faded, leaving only silence and the blackened shell of his bed. No record survives of a funeral or of any punishment for the act. In the eyes of the Crawley household, Morris was a servant, useful while healthy, expendable when not. The other staff learned quickly from his fate. Illness was hidden, pain endured in silence. The coach house itself became a place avoided after dark. Over the years, stories grew of screams that could be heard on still nights, of shadows moving in the corners where the fire had once burned hottest. The lesson taught to Morris was not lost on those who remained, and the cruelty that fueled the fire lingered long after the ashes cooled, settling into the very bricks of Monte Cristo. Harold was born into the shadows of Monte Cristo, the child of a maid whose name, like his, rarely appeared in any household ledger. His earliest years passed in the margins of the estate until a horse-drawn coach struck him down, leaving his body and mind forever changed. In a time when disability was met not with care, but with fear and shame, Harold became the family's hidden burden. He was chained in an outbuilding, his world reduced to a few square yards of dirt and darkness. The length of his confinement stretched across decades, 40 years according to those who whispered about him long after. At night, his cries drifted through the grounds, so persistent that local children believed a monster was kept behind the walls. They dared each other to approach, never sure if the sounds they heard were human at all. No doctor visited, no neighbor intervened. The community's silence wrapped itself around the Crawley estate as tightly as the chain around Harold's ankle. Visitors to the homestead in later years pointed to a hole in the brickwork, said to be worn smooth by the endless grinding of iron against stone. The cruelty of Harold's imprisonment did not belong to a single person. It was built into the routines of the house, accepted by those who passed through its gates and those who lived in the town below. When authorities finally discovered him, still chained and his mother dead for weeks in the same room, he was a grown man who had never known freedom. He was transferred to Kenmore Asylum, a place built for the unwanted and the lost. There he died soon after, his life measured not by years but by the length of a chain. Harold's story endures not because of any haunting, but because it exposes the deepest rot at the heart of Monte Cristo, the kind of cruelty that needs no ghost to chill the blood. In 1917, the Grand Staircase at Monte Cristo became the site of a tragedy that would echo through the years. A nursemaid, arms full with the Crawley family's infant granddaughter Ethel, began her careful descent from the upper landing. The house was quiet, the afternoon light slanting through the tall windows. Halfway down, the maid later insisted, she felt an unseen force press against her back. She stumbled. The baby slipped from her grasp, tumbling down the polished steps. Ethel's life ended before it had truly begun. The nursemaid, pale and trembling, told anyone who would listen that it was not clumsiness or distraction, but something else, a presence she could not see or name that caused her to fall. No one believed her. In a household that prized order and reputation, the story was quietly buried. The death was recorded as an accident, and the nursemaid dismissed soon after. The staircase itself seemed to remember. Over the decades, children visiting Monte Cristo grew restless and afraid as they neared the lower steps, some bursting into tears, others refusing to climb further. Parents spoke of a sudden chill, of the feeling of invisible hands pressing at their backs. Even adults, hardened to ghost stories, described a heaviness in the air, a sense that the house itself was watching. The architecture of Monte Cristo, its soaring ceilings and echoing halls, seemed to hold a charge as if sorrow could be built into brick and wood. The loss of Ethel was more than a family's private grief. It was a warning, whispered along the banisters and echoed in every footstep. The future, fragile and full of promise, could be snatched away in an instant. Monte Cristo's staircase, once a symbol of arrival and ascent, became a place where the boundary between past and present blurred, and where tragedy left its mark on the living and the dead alike. In December of 1910, Christopher William Crawley lay confined to his bed in the mansion he had raised from the earth. A carbuncle had formed on his neck, angry and swollen beneath the stiff white collar he insisted on wearing. The fabric chafed the wound day after day, driving the infection deeper. Blood poisoning set in, invisible but relentless, spreading through his body until his heart finally failed. On the 14th of December, at the age of 69, the man who had built Monte Cristo from nothing died not by violence or misfortune, but by the slow, unremarkable cruelty of his own vanity. The house did not fall silent. Instead, its rhythms altered. Elizabeth Crawley, now a widow, retreated from the world outside her gates. She moved through the rooms in black, her face set, her voice rarely heard. The grand gathering ceased. The laughter and music faded, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps and empty corridors. She converted a small upstairs room into a private chapel, draping its windows and filling it with the scent of candle wax and old paper. Day after day, she would kneel before her Bible, reading and praying for hours while the rest of the house went on without her. For 23 years, Elizabeth left Monte Cristo only twice. The world beyond the iron gates became a rumor, while inside, she drifted through memory and regret. The mansion, once a symbol of triumph, grew still and heavy, each room a monument to absence. In December 1910, the heavy doors of Monte Cristo closed behind Elizabeth Crawley and did not open again for nearly a quarter of a century. After the funeral, she retreated to the upper floor, leaving the world behind as if it had ended with her husband's last breath. Servants still moved through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in rooms that grew emptier each year. But Elizabeth herself became almost invisible, a presence felt more than seen. Local records from Junee note only her rare glimpses at an upstairs window, always in black, her face unreadable. No visitors called, and no family gathered for holidays. The house, once the center of the district's social life, transformed into a silent fortress. Neighbors whispered about the woman who would not leave, who barred herself inside with only her grief and her faith for company. Some said she left the estate just twice in those 23 years, though no one could agree on when or why. The routine of daily life, meals, letters, parish visits, simply vanished from the historical record. Elizabeth's seclusion became both legend and warning. A life suspended in mourning, the grand house reduced to a mausoleum by choice rather than fate. Each evening, as dusk settled over the paddocks, the windows of Monte Cristo remained dark. The world outside moved on. New families arrived in Junee. The railway brought change, but behind those locked doors, time seemed to stop. Whatever drove Elizabeth to such extremes, whether sorrow, guilt, or some deeper wound, she never spoke of it. The house absorbed her silence, storing it alongside the other tragedies that already lingered in its walls. And so began Monte Cristo's long vigil, a chapter of isolation that would shape every shadow and every rumor for generations to come. Elizabeth Crawley's days settled into a rhythm as precise as the ticking of the old carriage clock in the hall below. Each morning, she withdrew to a narrow attic room she had claimed for herself, transforming it into a private chapel. The space, once a servant's box room, became her sanctuary, crowded with religious icons, rosaries, and the scent of beeswax candles clinging to faded wallpaper. Hours slipped by as she read scripture aloud in a voice only the walls could hear, her prayers punctuated by the creak of floorboards and the distant calls of magpies in the paddocks outside. She wore mourning as if it were armor. Black lace veiled her face, a high, beaded collar pressed close to her throat, the fabric heavy and unchanging through the passing seasons. To the few who caught sight of her at a window, she cut a silhouette as severe and formal as Queen Victoria herself, a figure out of time, untouched by the world's progress. The servants, when they came, found her unchanged year after year, moving from chapel to bedroom and back again, always robed in black. No one could say for certain what occupied her thoughts as she knelt before the crucifix for hours, lips moving in silent recitation. Some believed grief alone anchored her to this ritual, while others whispered of burdens known only to her, guilt, perhaps, or penance for secrets kept behind shuttered windows. The chapel's dim light and the endless repetition of prayers became her world. On rare occasions, she would sign a letter or approve a delivery, her handwriting spidery and formal, but these interruptions were brief and impersonal. The routine never wavered. Meals were left outside her door and removed, often untouched. The sound of her footsteps overhead became as much a part of the house as the wind in the eaves. Over the years, the chapel filled with more icons and tokens, as if she hoped to crowd out whatever haunted her memory. For Elizabeth, devotion and isolation were indistinguishable, her faith both a comfort and a prison. The reasons for her withdrawal remained locked within those attic walls, leaving only speculation and the quiet certainty that the house itself was changing, shaped by the long vigil of its last mistress. August brought a biting winter to Junay in 1933. On the 12th day of that month, Elizabeth Crawley's long vigil ended as quietly as it had begun. She was 92 years old, frail but unyielding, still refusing to leave the upper rooms of Monte Cristo even as her health faltered. That night, a sharp pain in her abdomen signaled the rupture of her appendix, a small, unseen crisis that would prove fatal. Servants summoned help, but the doctor's journey from town was slow over frostbitten roads, and by the time he arrived, there was nothing left to do but sign the death certificate. Elizabeth died in the very house she had refused to abandon, surrounded not by family or friends, but by the silence she had cultivated for 23 years. No one could say what her final thoughts were as she lay in the darkness of her chapel, the air heavy with the scent of candle wax and old prayers. The house, stripped of its last matriarch, felt emptier than ever. With her passing, the last direct link to Monte Cristo's earliest tragedies vanished. The servants, those who remained, drifted away in the weeks that followed, their duties finished. The black lace morning dress was folded away for the last time, its owner beyond the reach of grief or memory. Outside, the paddock slept beneath a pale winter sun, unaware that the grand house on the hill had become a mausoleum in truth. Elizabeth's children, scattered by distance and years, did not return. There was no grand funeral procession, only a quiet burial and the slow settling of dust over locked doors. The world beyond Monte Cristo moved on, but within its walls, time seemed to pause. The house stood silent, its windows dark, waiting. What remained was an emptiness that felt both natural and unnatural, as if the building itself was holding its breath, absorbing the last echoes of Elizabeth's suffering. The era of the Crawleys had ended, leaving only the shell of a home and the secrets it refused to surrender. By the winter of 1948, the last of the Crawley family had walked away from Monte Cristo, leaving the house to its own devices on the lonely rise above Junay. For the first time since the heavy stones were set in place, no one lived behind its doors. The grand rooms that once echoed with footsteps and the clatter of dinner service became hollow, stripped of purpose and warmth. Rain found its way through cracked slate tiles, plaster peeled in slow curls from the ceilings. Vandals, emboldened by the absence of watchful eyes, forced open shutters and smashed stained glass. Ornate fireplaces were gutted for their iron grates, and carved banisters splintered under careless hands. Even the old billiard table vanished, carried off in pieces by those who saw only salvage, not history. As the years stretched on, Monte Cristo's decline became a kind of local legend. Children dared each other to approach the gates after dark, whispering stories of the lady in black, who still watched from an upstairs window. Farmers returning from the pub claimed they saw lights flickering in empty rooms, though the property had long been disconnected from the town's electric grid. Sometimes, neighbors spoke of voices rising on the night wind or the sharp slam of doors when no one was near. The house, once a symbol of prosperity, became a magnet for rumor and unease. No official records remained to detail the full extent of the damage, but the evidence lingered in every broken window and every scarred wall. The garden, once meticulously kept, grew wild, reclaiming the drive and choking the verandas with weeds. Inside, dust settled thick on the remnants of a vanished era, yet for all the destruction, something in the house resisted final ruin, a sense that it was waiting, holding its breath, unwilling to let go of the stories and sorrow it had gathered over decades. The emptiness did not bring peace. Instead, it fed the legend that Monte Cristo was a place where the past refused to die, and where the darkness inside grew heavier with every passing year. Night fell heavily on Monte Cristo in 1961, the house standing empty but for a single caretaker named Jack Simpson. He lived alone among the ruins, tending what little remained after years of vandalism and theft. The grand staircase was splintered, windows broken, and the wind moved freely through rooms stripped of their past. Jack's nights were spent in silence, a battered torch in one hand, keys in the other, his footsteps echoing through corridors that remembered too much. One evening, as darkness pressed close against the glass, a knock sounded at the front door. Jack was not expecting visitors. The town below had long since turned away from the mansion on the hill, leaving him as its last witness. He opened the door to a young man, face pale and eyes wide, who had come not out of friendship but from a strange compulsion. The details that followed would never be fully recorded in police reports or local newspapers. What is known is that the youth had spent that day watching Hitchcock's Psycho, not once but 3 times, absorbing each frame and every shadow until the line between fiction and reality blurred. Jack Simpson was shot at point-blank range, the sound swallowed by the empty house. There was no struggle, no warning, just a single act of violence that ended a life and deepened the mansion's darkness. Afterward, the killer moved through the property with a kind of grim purpose. In the dairy shed, he took a knife and carved 3 words into the old wood. Die, Jack, ha ha. Those words remain, gouged deep, a scar that refuses to fade with time. No trial would bring closure. The town whispered but did not linger on the details. The murder was absorbed into the fabric of the house, another story layered atop the old tragedies. For years, the house stood empty once more, its silence now broken by the memory of sudden violence. Monte Cristo's reputation as a place where evil gathered was no longer just rumor. The darkness had taken on a new human face. In 1963, Reginald Ryan stood at the threshold of Monte Cristo, holding the keys to a ruin that few in Junee believed could ever be saved. The house was a shell, shattered windows, stripped fireplaces, rain pooling on warped floorboards. Yet for R.E.G., a tailor by trade from Wagga Wagga, the broken grandeur of the old homestead offered something more than salvage. He and his wife Olive saw not just decay, but the bones of a place worth reviving, a monument to a vanished era, and a challenge that would test the limits of their resolve. The Ryans paid £1,000 for the property, a sum that strained their modest savings. Friends called it folly. The estate had stood empty since 1948, its reputation for misfortune growing with every year of neglect. But Reg was determined. He spent evenings scouring country auctions and demolition yards, hunting for Victorian sideboards, iron bedsteads, and stained glass panels that might restore the house's dignity. Olive set about cleaning layers of grime from the walls, her hands raw from scrubbing, but her vision clear. Monte Cristo would live again, not as a relic, but as a home. The scale of the work was daunting. Each room revealed new wounds, rot behind plaster, collapsed ceilings, nests of possums in the eaves. There were no grants, no heritage funds, only the Ryans' labor and a steady stream of small sacrifices. Reg's tailoring shop in town kept them afloat, but every spare shilling went into the restoration. They rebuilt the servants' quarters from the original brick cottage and pieced together the stables on the site of the old slab hut. The ballroom, once gutted, began to echo with life as they tracked down chandeliers and velvet curtains from distant sales. As the Ryans moved through the house, cataloging each scar and memory, the risk was always present. One misstep, one unexpected expense could end the project. Still, they pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose and the hope that the house might return their faith. By the time the sun set on their first night, the Ryans had poured everything they had into Monte Cristo. What waited for them inside was not just the weight of history, but something they could not yet name. The first night at Monte Cristo was meant to be a quiet beginning. Reg and Olive Ryan, exhausted from a day spent sweeping broken glass and shifting debris, loaded their children into the car for a final trip into Junee. When they returned, darkness had settled over the paddocks, yet the house on the hill blazed with light. Every window, upstairs, downstairs, even the attic, glowed as if the Crawleys still lived there, hosting some long-forgotten ball. The effect was so complete, so impossible, that Olive insisted they wait in the drive. There was no electricity connected to the property. The lines had been cut since the late 1940s, and the nearest pole stood rusted and empty at the end of the lane. Reg, practical and unshakable, told his family to stay put while he checked the house. He crossed the gravel alone, every step measured, the keys cold in his hand. As he reached the front door, every light in the house vanished at once. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, just sudden, absolute darkness. Inside, the air was colder than it had been all day. Reg walked from room to room, searching for an intruder or a hidden generator, but found nothing. The switches were dead, the sockets empty, the fuse box untouched. There was no source for the light, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Olive later described the feeling as standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The children, hushed by the strangeness, clung to each other in the car. The impossible illumination had lasted just long enough to make its point. The house was not empty. It had noticed their arrival and greeted them in its own way. That night, as the Ryans lay awake in borrowed beds, the silence pressed in from every side. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light, but a presence in itself, watchful, patient, and waiting to see what the new owners would bring. Long before anyone claimed to see a ghost, the animals sensed what the Ryans could not. On their first day, the family's dog bolted down the drive, vanishing into the fields. The cat, usually bold, arched its back on the veranda, refusing to cross the threshold. Olive called, coaxed, but the animal only stared, eyes wide, then slipped into the garden. Neither pet was seen again. The house, it seemed, had already made its position clear. The Ryans tried to settle in, but the animals they managed to keep fared no better. Chickens, locked in their pen each night, were found strangled by morning. No feathers scattered, no sign of a fox or ferret, no holes in the wire. The bodies were untouched, as if whatever killed them had no interest in food. Olive checked in the locks herself, searching for any gap, but found nothing. The parrot, bright green and always caged, was discovered one morning lying on its back, neck marked by invisible hands. The cage was padlocked, no wire bent, no sign of forced entry. Theories circulated, snakes, local boys, a clever predator, but none explained the precision or the silence. The deaths were methodical, almost ritual. One winter morning, Olive found the family cat sprawled in the hallway. Its fur had been peeled away in a single piece. The body opened with a surgeon's care, organs removed, eyes gouged out. The doors and windows were locked from the inside. No blood trail, no footprints, nothing to suggest a struggle. Olive buried the cat in the wild garden, hands shaking, and said nothing to the children. The horror lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Years passed. The Ryans brought more animals onto the property, but none would stay in the house. Even now, 14 feral cats roam the paddocks and sheds, but not one will cross the threshold. At dusk, they gather on the veranda, eyes fixed on the darkened hall, refusing to enter. Chickens are kept far from the main building. The air inside feels charged, as if waiting for something to happen. Visitors suggest wild dogs or a cruel prankster, but no one has ever caught a culprit. The closer the living come to the walls of Monte Cristo, the more the house seems to resist. The violence is silent, precise, and leaves only fear behind. Long after the animals had fled, the house began to reveal its other residents. In the early mornings, when the mist still clung to the paddocks, figures in Victorian dress appeared in the upper hallways. Visitors described the swish of skirts vanishing around corners, the sound of boots on polished wood where no one walked. The Ryan children, growing up surrounded by stories, learned to keep their eyes averted from the mirrors at dusk. Lawrence's sister once woke to find a tall man in farmer's clothes standing at the foot of her bed, his face shadowed, watching her with an intensity that left her frozen. She blinked and he was gone, but the cold that lingered in the room did not fade until sunrise. Not all apparitions kept to the ground. More than once, children playing in the garden spotted a man peering through a second-floor window, though no balcony stood beneath it. The window hung over empty air, yet the figure remained, suspended and silent, as if waiting for someone to notice. When Reg investigated, there was nothing but dust and the faint smell of old tobacco in the room. The AIR in certain rooms would drop without warning. Guests described walking through invisible walls of cold, so intense it burned the skin, breath blooming in clouds as if winter had invaded the house in midsummer. Olive Ryan herself spoke of an icy hand gripping her shoulder when she scolded a child for running in the hall. The pressure was unmistakable, firm, almost possessive. Yet, when she turned, the corridor was empty. Others, less welcome in their manners, reported the same chilling touch, followed by a voice whispering their names from behind closed doors. Temperature logs kept by the Ryans over the years show sudden plunges of 10 degrees or more, with no explanation from faulty wiring or open windows. On still nights, a fine mist gathers in the formal sitting room, swirling in the lamplight before dissolving as quickly as it appears. Disembodied voices drift through the stairwell, sometimes reciting prayers, sometimes calling for help. The records of these encounters fill page after page in the visitor logs, each account different in detail, but united by a sense of being watched by something that remembers. Elizabeth Crawley remains the most frequent presence. Those who enter her former chapel with disrespect, raising their voices, laughing at the old icons, often leave pale and shaken, rubbing at their arms where an unseen hand has left its mark. The house does not forgive rudeness, and it does not forget. In every shadow, every sudden chill, the past lingers, waiting to be acknowledged. The living are only ever guests at Monte Cristo. The true residents have never left. The staircase at Monte Cristo remains a place of uneasy silence, its polished wood worn smooth by generations of cautious feet. In 1917, a baby named Ethel fell to her death on these very steps, her cries echoing through the hallways before fading into memory. The story lingers, not just in family legend, but in the way children react even now, small hands gripping the banister, tears welling up for reasons they cannot name. Some refuse to climb at all, their distress rising with each step, as if sensing a presence that weighs heavier than gravity. Adults speak of a sudden pressure at their lower backs, a cold hand urging them forward or, more disturbingly, pulling them back. A century ago, a nursemaid claimed invisible fingers pushed her as she carried Ethel down to breakfast. Today, visitors report the same sensation, a fleeting touch, a chill that settles deep in the bones, as if the house remembers every stumble and every scream. Beyond the main house, the coach house stands apart, its brick walls scorched by more than just the Australian sun. In 1913, a stable hand named Morris died here, trapped by flames after Christopher Crawley dismissed his illness as laziness. The fire consumed the straw mattress, the walls blackened, and the sound of Morris's agony was said to carry across the paddocks. Those who linger near the coach house after dark often hear it still, a long, drawn-out scream that rises and falls with the wind, impossible to trace to any living source. Some describe it as the sound of someone burning alive, the kind of suffering that refuses to be silenced by time or reason. Chains rattle in the shadows, though no animals have been kept here in decades. Guests and investigators alike have recorded unexplained audio, electronic voice phenomena that capture faint cries or metallic clinks, always in the same spot where Harold, the chained boy, spent his years in darkness. The house does not offer explanations. Death certificates confirm Ethel's passing, but offer no comfort to those who feel her presence on the stairs. The fire that killed Morris is a matter of record, yet the agony seems to replay itself night after night. Paranormal investigators, armed with recorders and thermometers, leave with more questions than answers. Their logs fill with sudden drops in temperature, whispers caught on tape, and the persistent sense that the past is not finished with this place. Each incident draws more visitors, each seeking proof or solace, but the house remains indifferent. It simply replays what it has absorbed: pain, fear, and the echoes of lives cut short. In these spaces, tragedy is not history. It is a living memory, waiting to be felt again. Monte Cristo's doors are now open to the public, but the tragedies that once unfolded behind them have never truly left. The Ryans, determined to save the house from ruin, transformed it into a living museum. Visitors file past the grand staircase where the bleach-stained boards bear silent witness to the maid who fell from the balcony. Her story lost to rumor. Some say she jumped, others whisper she was pushed after falling pregnant by the master. The stain remains, a stubborn mark that no amount of scrubbing or polish has ever erased. In the outbuildings, the dairy and coach house are preserved not just for their architecture, but for the stories they hold. Here, the cries of Harold, chained for decades in darkness, linger in the minds of those who listen too closely. His chains, once a tool of discipline, now rattle only in memory and in the accounts of those who claim to hear them late at night. The museum's guided tours move from room to room, blending the opulence of the Victorian era with the unease that seeps from every corner. Olive Ryan, who managed the homestead well into her 90s, became as much a fixture as the portraits on the wall. She greeted guests with warmth, sharing tea and stories, but never shied away from recounting the house's darkest chapters. Her son, Lawrence, continues the tradition, inviting guests to decide for themselves what is history and what is haunting. Over the decades, thousands have walked the halls, some drawn by curiosity, others by the chance to experience the unexplained. Television crews arrived, cameras probing the shadows. In 2010, Ghost Hunters International spent a night within the walls, recording unexplained temperature drops and faint voices that seemed to drift from empty rooms. My Ghost Story followed in 2013, capturing the stories of visitors who left shaken by what they had seen or heard. These broadcasts brought a new wave of attention, and with it, more guests eager to witness the house's mysteries firsthand. Yet for all the exposure, the tragedies remain unresolved. The stories of the maid on the stairs and Harold in his chains are told as they always have been, without answers, only questions. The museum thrives on this tension, where commerce and legend intertwine, and history refuses to offer closure. In every guided tour, the past is never far away, and the line between fact and fear is left deliberately blurred. Monte Cristo stands as proof that places can inherit the weight of what happened within their walls: tragedy, violence, and isolation, echoing long after witnesses are gone. Today, the mansion draws thousands seeking answers, yet no investigation or restoration can erase the scars left behind. As long as stories persist and lights appear where none should, Monte Cristo reminds us, some houses refuse to let the past become history. What do you believe endures here?